Coming up on New Day at Arirang, President Moon Jae-in is set to give his farewell speech this morning, where he's likely to focus on achievements during the past 5 years and send a message of gratitude and unity to the people. Dozens of Ukrainians are dead after Russian forces bomb a school in eastern Ukraine. About 90 people have been sheltering in the school at the time of the attack. Meanwhile, G7 leaders have announced fresh sanctions against Russia to phase out their dependency on Russian energy. Beijing authorities are strengthening their COVID-19 measures, issuing more lockdown orders in other districts inside the capital.
Hello and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's Monday, May 9th, 8 a.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. I'm Woo Seung.
And I'm Lee Seung-jae. Thanks for joining us this morning, because over the next hour, we'll be giving you all the top headlines of the day and experts' insights on some of the key issues facing Korea and the rest of the world. In our top story this morning, President Moon Jae-in will give his farewell address in the coming hours on this, his final day in office.
He's likely to focus on his achievements made during the past 5 years and send a message of gratitude to the Korean people. In the afternoon, President Moon will meet with Singaporean President Halimah Yacob and Chinese Vice President Wang Qishan, who are visiting Seoul for President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's inauguration on Tuesday. Wang is likely to deliver a farewell message from Chinese President Xi Jinping. Moon will leave the Blue House at 6 p.m. and spend the night in Seoul before heading to his private residence in the southeastern city of Yangsan after attending Yoon's inaugural ceremony. Japan is sending Foreign Minister Yoshima Hayashi to South Korea to attend President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's inauguration ceremony on Tuesday. Visiting Seoul for a 2-day trip starting Monday, Tokyo's foreign ministry says Hayashi will hold talks with key members of the South Korean government. Japanese media says he's expected to meet with Foreign Minister nominee Park Jin on Monday and is arranging a separate meeting with Yoon to deliver a letter from the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. This will be the first trip to Seoul by a Japanese foreign minister since Taro Kono's visit in June 2018.
Now, North Korea, which fired a submarine-launched ballistic missile on Saturday, has somewhat unusually not commented on the launch in its state media. Now, there are a number of possible reasons for this, including the regime trying to create strategic ambiguity. Pae-eun-ji with this report.
North Korea usually gives a detailed report on its missile test the next morning. But on Sunday, its state media outlets, including KCNA and the Nodongshinmun, had still said nothing about the SLBM launch the day before. The North has also still not reported on the launch of an apparent ICBM last week on May 4th. And the same for the launch on March 17th of the Hwasong-17 ICBM, a launch that failed when the missile exploded shortly after liftoff. It's not exactly clear why the North is not commenting, but some experts say this is because of pressure from China. In fact, South Korea's intelligence chief Park Ji-won said Saturday that China and Russia have urged the North 5 or 6 times to stop testing ICBMs and nuclear weapons. Other experts say that the North might be trying to achieve strategic ambiguity and is trying to make these provocations seem like ordinary military actions. There is also speculation that the regime is waiting for the right time to announce progress in its nuclear weapons program all at once. The submarine-launched ballistic missile tested on Saturday, according to the South Korean military, flew some 600 kilometers toward the East Sea, at an altitude of around 60 kilometers. The Joint Chiefs of Staff said it was launched from a submarine near Sinpo, a port city on North Korea's eastern coast.
The series of recent ballistic missile launches by North Korea poses a serious threat to the Korean peninsula as well as to international peace and security. We strongly urge the North to immediately stop these actions, which are clear violations of UN Security Council resolutions.
Saturday's missile was launched just 3 days before South Korea inaugurates a new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, on May 10th. It also came 2 weeks before U.S. President Joe Biden is expected in Seoul for talks. Pae-eun-ji, Arirang News.
It's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. Outdoor mask mandates have been lifted for most situations across the country since last week. Now, while most people still choose to wear their masks over concerns on the Omicron variants, others have enjoyed some freedom during the warmer temperatures.
But with concerns over new subvariants of Omicron, will South Korea delay future plans for lifting indoor mask mandates? For some hints, we turn to Dr. Alice Tan, internist at Ms. Medi's Women's Hospital, joining us this morning. Good morning, Dr. Tan. And well, first off, it's been a week since South Korea lifted outdoor mask mandates. And well, what's your assessment of the situation? Is it too early to tell if it's going to increase the number of infected patients?
Well, thank you for having me. In terms of the outdoor mask mandates, it's thought that outdoor transmission accounts for less than 10% of all cases, which sounds like a small number, but given that the cumulative case numbers in Korea more than 17 million, that's maybe 1.7 million cases that could have been prevented or were caused by outdoor transmission. Even though the outdoor mask mandate was lifted, what I'm finding is that there's still many people inside the city, Seoul proper, who are deciding to keep their masks on. In terms of the timing, I think that yes, it is usually a matter of time before we see an increase in cases that reflect a change in policy. So we may see after maybe a week or two an increase in cases again. Hopefully we won't, but it is, I think it's only been a week, so we do need to wait a little bit more.
All right, so now that the outdoor mask mandates have been lifted, I guess the next step would be the indoor mask mandates. When do you think would be the right time to start lifting the indoor mask mandates?
So when we lift an indoor mask mandate, what this makes the community becomes much more dangerous for people who are vulnerable. So that would be the elderly, people with chronic medical conditions, immunocompromised, and anyone who's not been vaccinated. And of course, we need to remember that our children, the youngest of the young, have not been vaccinated against COVID-19. And we should remember that even yesterday, there was one more child fatality. And so this increases the cumulative number of deaths in children between the age of 0 and 19 to 29 now, which is a tenfold increase compared to where we were at the beginning of the Omicron wave. So the situation remains dangerous still for anyone who's not vaccinated, and that would include children. Less than 2% of all children between the ages of 0 to 12 years has been vaccinated with one dose. And so I would like to see more children protected against COVID-19 before we see lifting of indoor mask mandates.
Dr. Tan, we're hearing more and more about these variants of Omicron, the BA4, the BA5 reported in the US, and it sounds like it's only a matter of time before we hear about detected cases in South Korea. So what can you tell us about these variants?
So the BA.4, BA.5 subvariants are subvariants of Omicron, and they have two mutations that are known to cause an increase in transmissibility, and that's what seems to be going on. They seem to be maybe 10% more transmissible even than the BA.2 subvariant. They seem to be leading an increase in cases in South Africa, in the US, perhaps in the UK as well. In terms of whether or not our vaccines work against these subvariants, it looks like the vaccines still offer protection against severe disease when infected with BA4, BA5, but we still need to wait in terms of how virulent these strains are in people who are unvaccinated. In terms of treatments, we think that our current treatments will still work against these subvariants, but anytime we have a subvariant that is more transmissible than the previous variants, then it is just a matter of time before it gains dominance. And when it becomes much more transmissible, as we saw with Omicron in South Korea, that means more people are likely to get infected. People who have had a prior infection also may be vulnerable to reinfection. And so this is a cause for concern, and I think this is one of the reasons why we need to keep up high levels of genetic surveillance so that we're able to track new variants as they enter our country.
So, let's talk about the vaccines then. What's your recommendation for the second booster shots for the non-high-risk population? Should we still get our second booster shots? If, let's say for myself, I've already gotten my booster shot, should I still get my second booster shot even if I have already contracted COVID-19?
Well, if you've had COVID-19, what we're finding with the BA4, BA5 subvariants is when they compared people who had been vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and then also having had a history of infection, people who had been infected but also were vaccinated seemed to have higher levels of neutralizing antibody against BA4 compared to people who had infection but no history of prior vaccination. So given the fact that we're seeing more and more variants on the horizon, COVID's not over, protection from previous doses is waning, I think it is a good idea to get the second booster. In my case, I'm considered low risk, but as a doctor, I'm around patients who might be vulnerable. Also, it's graduation season. I will be attending graduation ceremonies, therefore I'll be traveling, I'll be mingling with other people. Also, I will be with my parents, I'll be with my 99-year-old grandmother. I don't want to be the one who inadvertently gets COVID and then spreads it to people who may be vulnerable. So in my case, I got my second booster 2 days ago. And so right now it's, people have a case-by-case way of deciding whether or not to get the second dose, at least in the United States. But I think for people who need to not just protect themselves, but protect others around them who might be vulnerable to COVID, it's a good idea to get the second booster.
Thank you as always, Dr. Tan, for your insights. We'll speak to you again next week.
Thank you.
Russian attacks in the eastern south of Ukraine have intensified, with dozens of people feared dead after a school was bombed during a Russian air raid in the eastern part of the country. This comes as Western leaders promise to stop importing Russian oil. Kim Yo-sun has more.
Scores of Ukrainians are feared missing or dead as a result of a Russian air raid which bombed a school in eastern Ukraine. The governor of the Luhansk region confirmed Sunday that the bomb killed 2 people, while some 60 people were likely to have died as the buildings collapsed. So far, some 30 civilians have been pulled from the debris. Around 90 people had been sheltering at the school. Over in the Ukrainian port city of Mariupol, the last group of civilians trapped in a steel plant have been evacuated. Officials say that all women, children, and elderly people have been brought out from underground bunkers, adding that this part of the humanitarian operation in Mariupol is now over. But hundreds of Ukrainian fighters are thought to remain in the plant as Russian forces tried again over the weekend to storm Azovstal with tanks and artillery. The developments come as leaders from the Group of 7 pledged Sunday to phase out or ban the import of Russian oil. The promise was made in a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, where they stressed support from and unity among Western allies. They further ensured that this will be done in a timely and orderly fashion. Meanwhile, Washington announced new sanctions against Russia. The White House explained that Kremlin-controlled media outlets will be cut off from American advertisers, prohibiting Moscow from using U.S. management and accounting consulting services. Also on Sunday, U.S. First Lady Jill Biden made an unannounced visit to Ukraine in a show of support for its people.
It was important to show the Ukrainian people that this war has to stop. And this war has been brutal, and that the people of the United States stand with the people of Ukraine.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also made a surprise visit to Ukraine, emphasizing that his country supports Ukraine in seeking justice. He also added that Russian President Vladimir Putin was responsible for the, quote, heinous war crimes. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Now, the prolonged war in Ukraine is causing a butterfly effect and putting strain on the global economy. Now, here in South Korea, consumers are also feeling the effects with soaring food prices. Our Shin Yeon reports on why the fallout from this conflict should serve as a wake-up call for trade-dependent countries like South Korea.
Visits to supermarkets here in South Korea are becoming more and more expensive. Because of the war in Ukraine, wheat import prices have seen an all-time high in 13 years. Though Ukraine isn't the biggest wheat supplier to Korea, it still has a great impact on the market as one of the world's greatest wheat producers. That's why wheat-based products like bread and noodles have seen prices soar. We're also expecting to see the price of vegetable oil and processed foods like ramen and snacks go up now that Indonesia has expanded its ban on palm oil exports. Indonesia has done this to ease its own cooking oil prices during this uncertain time. Due to the export ban, South Korea's palm oil prices have increased by 40% compared to last year and a whopping 95% compared to early 2020. Korean shoppers say they're feeling the impact of these higher prices.
지금은 정말 배로 올랐어요. 너무 많이 올라가지고 그러니까 사더라도 그냥 놓게 돼요. 물가가 너무 많이 올라서.
나는 차로 출퇴근을 하는데 기름값이 너무 많이 오른 거예요. 그래서 어차피 공급자들은 월급은 정해져 있는데 이제 지출하는 금액은 점점 너무 커져서 좀 아쉬운 면이 좀 있고.
이렇게 소비자 물가가 인상한 데에 대해서 이유를 알고 계실까요?
일단은 뭐 러시아의 이제 전쟁, 우크라이나 전쟁이 이제 큰 영향이 있는 것 같고.
세계 각곳에 있는 일이 나한테도 이런 영향을 끼친다고 이런 생각은 혹시 하신 적이 있을까요?
없었어요. 근데 이랬는데 저희는 그쵸 다른 나라의 전쟁이라고 생각만 했는데 갑자기 모든 게 다.
The reason why events in other countries affect Korea is because the country has one of the highest trade dependency rates in the world. As of 2020, trade took up 69% of Korea's whole GDP. Even though South Korea doesn't heavily rely on Ukraine for its wheat imports or Russia for its gasoline, its economy still wavers when these giant suppliers are cut off from the global market, because it has to share a smaller pie with other countries. This is a butterfly effect. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy has been forming task forces to strengthen Korea's trade security during geopolitical challenges. In February, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, they launched the Russian Desk.
Even before the international community started putting sanctions on Russia, our task force informed local companies so they could prepare. A few years ago, when the US and China engaged in a trade war, we formed a similar task force. We've been doing this after recognizing how a localized conflict across the world can have far-reaching consequences for a trade-dependent country like Korea.
Geopolitical events can put South Korea's food security at high risk. This is because Korea has the lowest food self-sufficiency rate among all OECD countries. South Korea only produces a little over 45% of its own food and only 20% of its own grain. This figure is much lower than countries like Canada and the US, each with self-sufficiency rates for grain surpassing 100%. A rural economics expert said South Korea needs to solve this matter quickly.
There may be a day when there aren't any grains available for import due to worsening climate change. In the future, we might be fighting for food. South Korea needs to be prepared.
We've already seen global grain supply shocks. Over the past 20 years, there were 3 major times when food prices soared due to limited supply. The first was in 2008 when the world's biggest grain producer, the US, was hit with drought. The second was in 2012. Russia had banned grain exports, and the U.S. required more corn crops to be mixed into gasoline sold at its pumps. And the third time in late 2020, when the biggest granaries couldn't produce much due to La Niña and climate change. That's why the National Institute of Crop Science is trying its best to increase the country's grain self-sufficiency.
South Korea is losing more control over its food security since more people are eating wheat-based products instead of just rice. While the average Korean eats 33 kilograms of wheat every year, the country's wheat self-sufficiency rate is under 1%.
South Korea mostly consumes rice. That's why its rice self-sufficiency rate has always stayed near 100% over the past decade. But over the last 30 years, rice consumption levels have decreased by 50%. Wheat consumption, on the other hand, has been increasing every year. By 2030, South Korea aims to raise its wheat self-sufficiency rate from 1% to 10%. To do this, the National Institute of Crop Science formed a wheat research team in 2018, specializing in finding ways to distribute homegrown wheat across the country.
Our priority is quality over quantity. We want companies and consumers to look for Korean wheat, even though it may be pricier because it has a premium value. So we're inventing technology that can make our homegrown wheat more nutritious and not cause any allergies. We're also developing speed breeding technology so it takes a shorter amount of time to actually produce it.
As a trade-dependent country, South Korea and its citizens feel the impact of what happens elsewhere in the world. But South Korea is still trying to boost its self-sufficiency, whether it's by producing its own wheat or implementing more policies. There's still some hurdles left for the country to consider, though, like who will be growing the wheat given Korea's aging population. 신예은, Arirang News, 전라북도 Province.
Well, that report by Yoon wraps up the first half of our news this morning as we're just about to take a short news break.
That's right, but stick around. We'll be back in about a minute with the second part of our newscast, beginning with Global Insight.
Now, the global economy is expected to improve slightly this year. The level dropped, but future economic indicators weren't so positive. Faster growth in emerging
U.S.-China trade deal may be near, while a rally in global
For an economic outlook of South Korea's economy for 2020, we get a preview now from our business correspondent.
Arirang, what matters?
What made this all possible? LiDAR technology is being used to improve accuracy.
It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, Monday marks the last day of the Moon Jae-in administration after promising to build an inclusive nation built on income-driven economic growth and social justice. Moon will leave the presidential office today, leaving behind a country that is facing soaring inflation, record debt, and high income inequality, along with low trust in government and politics. Can the Yoon administration tune into the needs of the people and turn things around for South Korea? We reflect on the last 5 years of leadership in South Korea and the next 5 years going forward with Professor Lee Hyun, Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School, and Professor Mason Ritchie at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul. Very warm welcome to you both. And well, let's begin with you, Professor Lee. Now, the Moon Jae-in administration over the past 5 years, it was all about building an inclusive nation, or 포용국가 in Korean, based on income-driven growth and rooting out what he called social evils to achieve a fairer society. Well, how do you think they did on that front if you were giving them a letter grade in terms of effort and achievement?
You would probably have to give them a fairly low grade. I think you think about three situations, I think, with respect to this government, outgoing government. First relates to jobs, and then second relates to the real estate market, and then sort of the Joguk scandal. So with respect to jobs, so the administration, when it came in, promised about 500,000 new jobs every year, but it only achieved, really, the economy only achieved 173,000 jobs per year. Now, that can be explained, of course, by the pandemic, but there are also other policies that the government sort of instituted that sort of limited the abilities of certain peoples, or at least the younger generation, to get jobs. And I think this is sort of a reflection of the government's sort of reaction against the market, and so not really following market-driven principles. And I think this government intervention sort of really laid into this problem of jobs. But also, I think most notably in the economic sector, the real estate market. And just things have gotten really out of hand. And so the younger generation, again, is finding it very difficult to find housing, especially in the Seoul capital region. And this is really a reaction against this, again, this market-driven principle, which really, I think, didn't really address some of the core problems related to the real estate market. And then lastly, in terms of fairness, the Jooguk scandal, I think, symbolized some of the maybe underlying hypocrisy of this administration, because while Moon himself wasn't really attached to any particular scandal, those around him really sort of didn't follow through with the principles that this administration laid out. So people, they said you shouldn't own more than 2 houses in this administration, but a lot of high-level officials owned 2 apartments or more. And famously, Jooguk and his daughter and his wife, they were embroiled in this issue about getting admission to universities and medical schools. So I think a lot of people were disenchanted by this sort of approach to the fairness issue. So all in all, a very low score.
And your take on Mr. Moon's 5 years in office, Professor Ritchie, as he leaves office after promising to deliver an inclusive nation, a fair society, and of course, improved inter-Korean relations?
Professor Lee just took a lot of my ideas, to be totally honest with you. When I heard that question, I also thought that really there's sort of a bitter disappointment, I think, in the fact that Moon came into office promising unity and clean government after the scandals of the Park Geun-hye administration, and he leaves office with a very divided electorate, and both to some degree around him and certainly around those who he surrounded himself with, a real stench of scandal, including the Chokuk Justice Minister scandal and the Songnam land scandal. His mixed record, I think, however, on policy, has one enormous bright spot, and that's COVID. For better or for worse, his administration is going to get credit for managing the pandemic about as well as any country on planet Earth. And the fact that the administration didn't politicize that very much, and the response to that was driven largely by science, by the epidemiologists, I think speaks well to some degree for how he might go down in the history books beyond some of the other problems that he's had. On North Korea, I would give him a very mixed score. Things could have been worse, I think, in terms of potential conflict with North Korea. He does probably get some credit for the peace offensive that took place around the Pyeongchang Olympics. But of course, as things wound down at the Hanoi summit in 2019 and up until the present, obviously his policy there ultimately failed. Although, to be fair, most presidents in South Korea fail in North Korea. Also, real estate and employment for youth, that's obviously a huge problem, as we just saw. And I'll throw in also gender issues and human rights. Moon is a human rights lawyer, wasn't able to push through the human rights law in the National Assembly, although his own party has a supermajority there. And gender issues remain a huge issue here in Korea. And frankly speaking, his party should be out in front on that. They're the Progressive Party, and yet they're not. And that their own party has now had multiple sexual harassment scandals, in addition to not moving forward on gender equity policies here in Korea. So a very mixed record and bitter disappointment, I think.
Mr. Moon does leave on a very sort of mixed, with very mixed reviews, I suppose. But what he did manage to do is, well, his PR team was working very hard, and there were a number of brands and slogans that the government used over the last 5 years, Professor Lee, such as inclusive nation or nation-like nation, various mottos and brands. And, well, what's going to be the motto of the Yoon administration? What kind of society do you think that the incoming administration will try and achieve?
Well, I think that the biggest two mottos or the 2 words here are key are renewal and co-prosperity. So this is obviously a sort of reaction sort of against the last 5 years. given the economic stagnation that the country has faced. And so I think this new administration is coming in with this desire to sort of reinvigorate the Korean economy. And I think this is the topic of renewal. And then, of course, with respect to co-prosperity, questions about sort of just unemployment, again, the real estate market, I mean, the economic well-being of most Koreans, especially with inflation going up into the cost of things, as we heard earlier in the reporting here. So I think this is really the big issue, is coming back out of this last 5 years and then into a post sort of pandemic era, that now where the Korean economy can sort of really generate more jobs for people, and then give people sort of opportunities within the real estate market to be able to own housing. And I think this is sort of the biggest sort of next 5 years. We'll see whether or not this administration will be able to really do what it says it's going to do with respect to the economy and with respect to the people's well-being and welfare.
It's clear that the South Korean people need change and they want to see tangible improvements in their livelihoods. And Professor Ritchie, well, the incoming Yoon administration is actually bringing back many familiar faces from the previous Lee and Park administrations. And many of its officials and advisors, they tend to be male professors nearing retirement age. So what will they really have to do in order to prove that they can bring these fresh initiatives and the reforms that people want to see in order to recover socially and economically amid various difficult conditions?
So I would lay out, 4 areas where they should pay attention. First is they should be open-minded. The second is I think they should pay attention to the concerns of youth here, let's say those less than 35. Gender, I think, needs to be something that the administration pays attention to. And to be frank, the campaign does not give you a lot of confidence that that's going to be the case. And then a willingness to compromise and work with the opposition, which, of course, has a supermajority in the National Assembly. And so domestically, if the administration wants to move forward on its priorities, it's going to have to find a way to work with the opposition up until at least 2024, when the next National Assembly elections take place. I don't think that that's very likely to happen, simply because in politics that typically tends not to be the case. But I think that those are 4 areas to look for. Whether or not the team around Yoon is constitutionally capable of doing that is, I think, an open question, at least on domestic policy. On foreign policy, I happen to know a few members of the administration. Kim Sung-han, the appointee for the National Security Advisor position, Park Jin, the incoming foreign minister nominee, and they are very intelligent. They're well respected abroad. They are, I think, very global in their outlook, and so I think that they are capable of adapting to events as they're going to happen in foreign policy, which I think is really critical for having a foreign policy that is both principled and one that is capable of dealing with events as they happen globally, because very rarely do the states' foreign policy teams have a chance to craft their foreign policy the way they want it to. So much of success and failure depends on things that are outside of their control.
And Professor Lee, in terms of improving the domestic situation amid various difficulties, the head of Yoon's transition committee, An Choi-soo, he announced 110 tasks for the incoming government last week. What do you think are some key priorities that the Yoon administration will pursue from day one?
I think most notably, probably sort of reversing the Moon administration's policy to phase out nuclear power. I think that's going to be a really big task. I think just restarting some of the construction that's been happening with respect to nuclear power plants, and getting Korea to be sort of energy self-sufficient to some degree, I think is really important. So that's one big area. Naturally, then also, cutting real estate taxes and certain regulations that really have hampered, again, the ability of people to be able to have access to housing. So not only sort of increasing sort of the burden, lessening the burden for people with respect to government regulation, with respect to housing, but also increasing the number of units available to people in sort of the region. And then I think lastly, among the 110 things, it's of course a very ambitious plan, but interestingly, I think one of them also is going to be if the new incoming Minister of Justice is actually put into place, one of Yoon's confidants as a prosecutor. I think the question about limiting the recent actually law with respect to limiting prosecutorial investigations, that's been also part of the agenda I think this new administration is going to put into place in terms of figuring out how this new law is going to actually work with respect to the police and the prosecutors. And so obviously there's a lot of things going on here. And so I think that looking at 110 things that the new administration is going to do is a tall task. And I think we'll be, after this 5 years is over with, we'll look back and see whether or not those 110 things were actually accomplished during his administration.
And Professor Ritchie, of course, the recent presidential election that got Mr. Yoon into power, it was very polarised when it came to the voting. It's a very tight race. And well, how well do you think the incoming administration is going to be received by the general public? That's to you, Professor Ritchie.
Yeah, well, he's off to a bad start so far in terms of approval ratings. He has among the lowest approval ratings ever for an incoming president. Mostly I think that has to do with the polarization of the Korean electorate in general. But we shouldn't forget, of course, that he's, I think, already made one sort of baffling move, at least with respect to public opinion, in terms of the rushed process to move the Blue House relocation forward. Even among conservatives, that the rushed nature of that decision seemed rash and a little confusing. Also, the tense relationship between Yoon and Moon during the transition period, I think, kind of reflected badly on Yoon a little bit. Now, he has plenty of time to make up for that. And, like most presidents, he'll probably try to book some successes relatively early, and he'll probably get a bump in the polls. But, I think, certainly by the time of the upcoming local elections, we're going to get a sense, a sort of barometer sense of where he is and where his party is. And both sides, the opposition and the ruling party, will have to take stock of where they are in terms of popular support as we look towards 2024 and the National Assembly elections here. And I really think one of the biggest things that will make a difference in his overall approval rating is going to be the extent to which he's willing to work with and compromise with the opposition. And I think that's going to make a difference between Yoon being a failure and being considered a statesman.
Professor Lee, the same question to you. How well do you think the Korean public is going to receive the Yoon administration when it when it takes office on Tuesday? And how will this be reflected in the upcoming local elections and the by-elections too, of course?
As Professor Ritchie mentioned, the depolarization, I think, that exhibited in the election, I think, is going to be reflective of what's going to happen, I think, early on in his administration. There was only about 250,000 people, voters, sort of separating between, his candidacy and Lee Jae-myung's candidacy. So this was a tightly, controlled election. And so I think, given that this was so close in terms of the electorate, I think there's going to be obviously people on either side. If you're progressive versus conservative, there's going to be a lot of issues that I think both sides are going to clash on. I don't expect this to be sort of a smooth presidency, but given the nature of sort of Korean politics, I think as we all have seen before, progressives and conservatives really, I think, have very deep sort of differences with respect to sort of outlook and as far as the future of the country is concerned. And so I think there is this issue about how you can work within government and how President Yoon will be able to work with the National Assembly. I think that's key here, whether or not compromises can be made. But I think in the end, it seems to me that given the trends of what's happening in Korean society, that we're going to see, I think, really, a deep sort of division within the country with respect to conservatives and progressives on a lot of these important social issues as well as economic ones. And so I think in the future, we'll see what happens in terms of whether Yoon can overcome this division. But I think it's here to stay. And I think this is going to be a problem that's going to exist within the next 5 years for this administration.
That was Yoon, Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School, and Mason Ritchie, Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Beijing is expanding its lockdown areas as the number of new COVID-19 infections ticks up in the Chinese capital. Now, according to city authorities, they have identified 20 areas in the city as high risk and 34 as medium risk, adding 2 and 6 from the previous day, respectively. Now, earlier this month, Beijing conducted PCR tests on all residents in the Chaoyang district, where many were said to be infected. The city will now conduct mass testing in 4 more districts. Authorities also said they'll strengthen the lockdown in Chaoyang district. More people will not be allowed to leave their homes. Now, the number of new cases in the city was 62 on Saturday, up 9 from the previous day. Now, the U.S. Senate will vote Wednesday on legislation to codify abortion rights into law. Now, this according to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Speaking on Sunday, Schumer said he will file cloture on Monday and the Senate will vote on the bill 2 days later. Now, this comes after a Supreme Court draft opinion was leaked last week, indicating the majority of justices appeared poised to overturn the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling. Now, Roe v. Wade is the legal precedent ensuring abortion access for Americans. Now, in other news, hypothermia has been a big risk for maritime rescue operations. Now, to lower this danger, a South Korean research team has developed an electric skin that produces a current and helps control body temperature underwater. Yoon with this report.
In the event of a major maritime accident, underwater rescues are essential. But such operations have many risks. One of the biggest risks is that heat loss from the human body is 25 times faster in water. So the more time spent underwater, higher the risk of hypothermia. But now local researchers have developed an electric skin that will allow wearers to work underwater for longer by significantly reducing the loss of body heat. This patch of electric skin is soft and very elastic. It uses thermoelectric technology to generate electricity from the temperature difference between the cold water and the warm body. As soon as the electric skin is placed underwater, the graph shows a rise in power generation, which is 60 times higher in the water than in the air. Another advantage of the skin is that the electricity it generates can also be used to power various sensors, including an electrocardiogram, allowing real-time monitoring of underwater workers.
The seebeck effect allows production of voltage from the temperature difference between the body and water. When abnormalities in body temperature are detected, the Peltier effect goes into effect to maintain electric current, which controls body temperature.
This new electric skin can produce current continuously as long as there is a temperature difference, and the greater the difference in temperature, the higher the current produced. An attached battery can provide a more stable current in extreme environments.
This skin can be used not only in water but also in very cold areas like the North or South Pole to maintain body temperature. And because it also has a cooling function, it can be used in hot areas as well.
The team will continue their follow-up research on this electric skin to further improve its efficiency, as well as enabling this technology to work on larger skins so that it can be worn as a full outfit. Yoon, Arirang News.
Now, for a look at news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Good morning to you, Matthew.
Good morning to you as well.
Hi, Matthew. Well, let's start in Cuba, where there was an explosion at a hotel over the weekend.
Well, that's right. The blast took place at the Saratoga Hotel in the Cuban capital of Havana on Friday and has left at least 30 people dead and dozens injured. Now, on Saturday, Cuban state media reported 32 deaths. However, the presidency put the death toll at 26 and the number hospitalized due to injury at 64. Rescue workers are continuing to search the hotel's ruins as authorities believe more bodies remain inside the structure, while Cuban state TV said that survivors could potentially be trapped in the basement of the destroyed hotel. Witnesses described a massive blast that also destroyed vehicles outside the 96-room structure. Meanwhile, Cuba's presidential office has said the explosion was likely caused by a gas leak. John Lee has officially been endorsed as Hong Kong's new chief executive. As the sole candidate on Sunday, he received votes from over 1,400 members of the pro-Beijing election committee, granting him the required majority to become the financial hub's next leader, taking over from Carrie Lam. Only 8 voted against Lee. Now, following the vote, he said it was his, quote, historic mission to lead a new chapter for Hong Kong. He pledged to unite the city and preserve Hong Kong's international status as an open and competitive financial hub. However, known to be pro-Beijing, Lee oversaw some of the violent crackdowns on Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters in 2019. Costa Rica's former finance minister, Rodrigo Chavez, was sworn in as the country's new president on Sunday. Formerly a World Bank executive, Chavez now faces challenges in the form of a 23% poverty rate, 14% unemployment rate, and rising foreign debt at roughly 70% of the country's GDP. This comes as tourism from the Central American country was hit by the pandemic. Chavez, who resigned from his 30-year-long career at the World Bank amid a sexual harassment scandal, has promised to abolish all gender discrimination and harassment. Last month, the 60-year-old offered sincere apologies to his 2 accusers. Over 160,000 runners from 165 countries took part in the Wings for Life World Run on Sunday. The event raised $4.9 million via entry fees and donations for spinal cord research. No start or finish lines were set for the race, as people all over the world joined the run at one of 7 large-scale runs or participated through an app. The race finished when runners were caught by a real or virtual catcher car, which started 30 minutes after participants. This weekend marked the 9th edition of the race on Sunday, with runners each averaging 11.9 kilometers. The participants all started at the same time, meaning a night race for some. In India, thousands of Hindus took a holy dip in the Ganges River in the early hours of Sunday. Taking place in the country's spiritual capital of Varanasi, the event celebrates Ganga Saptami. The ritual commemorates the river, which is considered a goddess according to Hindu beliefs, as devotees take a holy bath and wish for the prosperity and welfare of humankind. One of the most revered rivers in the world, the Ganges is worshipped by Hindus, who make up 80% of India's 1.3 billion people. They call it Ganga Mata and believe a dip in the river absolves a lifetime of sins.
Good morning. We had murky skies and breezy conditions yesterday with some spotty rain overnight, but today will be the complete opposite of Sunday for central regions. The morning temperatures are a few notches lower. Highs will be about 7 degrees higher today, leading to wide gaps in between lows and highs. While wet clouds that dropped rain in central regions have moved to south and will sprinkle rain through the morning, while Jeju and the south coast will see winds picking up in the late afternoon. Morning temperatures are 2 to 4 degrees lower in central regions under bright sunshine, but similar in the southern provinces, starting out in the low to mid-teens this morning. Highs in Seoul will go up to 25 degrees Celsius, Daegu topping out at 21 degrees. UV rays will be very strong in Gyeongsang-gu provinces and surrounding regions this afternoon. We will be seeing more clouds through the first half of the week, with frequent rain in the forecast on Jeju this week, with highs staying above seasonal averages. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
That wraps up our newscast for this morning, but we will be back tomorrow for our Tuesday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thanks for tuning in, but stick around for more updates throughout the day and have a great rest of your day wherever you are. And as always, do take care.